إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد, I've noticed recently that some du'a in the West have taken it onto themselves to propagate the claim that learning and teaching philosophy is not haram in Islam. It's only bad philosophy that we should condemn, not the very principle of doing philosophy. Furthermore, they claim that this is the position to be understood from some of the writings of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, contrary to the teaching of contemporary Salafi scholars, especially in Saudi Arabia. Now obviously, there's an issue of definition and equivocation to be addressed before we go any further with establishing a general ruling here. It's become clearer to me where the talbis, misconception and distortion comes from. When I recently heard a particular discussion between two British preachers maintaining that Muslim scholars of old only meant the philosophy of Ibn Sina and Farabi in particular, whenever they generalized the rulings on what they called philosophy. So if you're not committed to the beliefs of Ibn Sina, then you're not involved with the falsafa that some scholars of old had condemned. This claim, of course, is exclusively founded on the fact that Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, who was himself a philosopher, by the way, as we shall elaborate shortly, wrote his famous book, Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of Philosophers, only to condemn the thought and beliefs of Ibn Sina in particular. So that's it, folks. This is the issue that our scholars had with philosophy as a practice of reasoning and deep thought, according to which philosophy was given a general ruling. Okay, and that's actually an Ash'ari characterization of the issue, by the way. This is not how Ahl Sunnah, true Ahl Sunnah, think of what philosophy is and why it's condemned among scholars of Islam. Okay, this is not why Ahl Sunnah condemn philosophy. This is why Ash'ari take that position when they do, because they follow Ghazali in what he wrote about Ibn Sina in particular. That's the problem that they had with what they called philosophy at the time. Now, in fact, one of these preachers, one of these du'a, declared that nowhere in the athar of the Salaf, the narrations of their teachings, can we find an explicit condemnation of philosophy per se. At least, he says, not like we find condemnation of kalam or ilm kalam. Consequently, it could be argued with no further effort that those contemporary scholars who condemn philosophy in any general sense are actually at odds with the ways of the Salaf, not in keeping with them as they claim. Alright. Now let's start with the definition. When we say philosophy is haram and should not be taught at any capacity to Muslims, what exactly do we mean by that? For starters, let's agree that the very term philosophy was coined by a particular group of ancient Greek teachers who founded the so-called scholastic tradition, which continues to define the scholarly tradition of the Western Academy to this day. So while the word itself means the love of wisdom or the affinity to wisdom, the tradition itself that this term was coined to describe is fundamentally at odds with the proper meaning of wisdom, as we shall attempt to show as briefly as possible, of course, in this lecture. In his major attack against Aristotelian logicians, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah goes to great length in identifying the main methodological and epistemological issues with that tradition. As he mounts his attack, he recounts the term philosophy and the meaning they held for it, and argues that if indeed it were true that those people did love wisdom and cling to it, then what they do, as they claim, of course, then what they do is bad philosophy, not proper philosophy. Right? If indeed they were honest in seeking wisdom, then they would let their minds work normally like they should, follow the call of fitra that makes the mind work properly, and thereby would only end up following and submitting themselves entirely to the prophets of Allah rather than what they all ended up believing and doing. So the use of the term proper philosophy in that treatise and in that context was purely a rhetorical device to establish the point that what they claimed to be wisdom is actually far from it. Obviously, if you read the passage where he says that, in the context of what he was doing in the book in general, you would easily understand that. And yet I was stunned by the writings of some people who pretend to be Salafi in their general creed of belief and to be lovers of Ibn Taymiyyah, and yet they used that paragraph in the book to argue that if he were alive today, he would encourage people to study Western philosophy and to do philosophy the way philosophers do and the way they claim that he did. They claim that he was a philosopher and he was doing philosophy himself. I termed this innovation philosophical Salafiyya, and you may call them the Philo-Salafis or the Salafilosophers, if you will. They're busy publishing books that seek to place Ibn Taymiyyah himself in the mold of one particular school, of one particular school of philosophy or another, one that they ascribe to, naturally. Okay, a school that he knew not, and the very core of which would bring to ruin most of the efforts he paid in warning Muslims against the foundations of fallacy that led to all the innovations of Kalam and Mutakallimin. Rahimahullah. I will return to Ibn Taymiyyah shortly, of course, since his writings have been subject to all kinds of misguided reading and interpretation you can possibly imagine, especially by those Salafilosophers. May Allah guide them to the right path. Again, let me reiterate that philosophy is a term that was coined by the scholastic philosophers of ancient Greece to describe the tradition they founded for themselves and they were involved with at the time, of course. And while it may seem to the untrained eye that that tradition is ancient history now, and thereby whatever philosophers are doing today has nothing to do with that tradition, this is in fact far from the truth. If you understand properly the main points of criticism that Ibn Taymiyyah mounted against the Greeks in his many treatises where he addressed those issues, you would realize that they boil down to three main points. Sophistry in posing questions and in addressing rational necessities, and the potential for skepticism, regress, and indetermination in argumentation. Engaging in metaphysical theorization, subsequently forcing metaphysical definitions onto the common use of language where none is needed. Alright? The definitions and the like. Okay? Employing analogy and deduction in issues where it is clearly unreasonable to do so. Thereby ending up, of course, characterizing things that are mental constructs, things that are only abstract things, characterizing them as actual things in reality, in the real world. Okay, which is one of the most common mistakes and issues, fallacies that philosophers commit, and Ibn Taymiyyah has, in fact, pointed them out in more place than one in his books. Now, while he identified these issues as fundamental issues with Greek philosophy in particular, and in Kalam subsequently, it can easily be shown that nobody could be called a philosopher today or a mutakallim unless he or she feels at least comfortable with people who commit any or all of these fallacies combined, and is willing to give them proper respect as fellow thinkers and peers in the academy. And when you fault them, you only fault them by means of rational argumentation. Okay, and by rational argumentation, I mean a deductive argument. You mount a deductive argument against them to falsify what they're saying, whatever it is. Okay, the very idea of condemning someone because of what he believes or classifying a certain difference in thoughts as unacceptable or intolerable goes against the very foundations of that tradition as it stands. Alright, everybody should be allowed to say anything and to propagate any belief, no matter how fallacious and destructive it might be to the deen and the soul, and be allowed the chance to argue for it in a friendly environment. Okay, and when you respond to them, like I said, you respond by means of deductive arguments, not in any other way. This general sentiment is a fundamental part of Western academy today because the academy was founded on the Greek scholastic tradition that suffered from those three major issues as roughly identified by Shaykh al-Islam. Okay, as you can in fact surmise from all his writings. It is precisely because they all submit themselves to these methodological conditions and they wouldn't be called philosophers at any capacity any otherwise, that it's become notoriously hard and unattainable to define philosophy itself in any comprehensive or exclusive manner. Another point that we have to raise here is that if indeed it is true that the Salaf have condemned Kalam and warned against it because of what the practice itself does to the deen, despite the fact that Ilm al-Kalam is loosely defined as the practice of doing philosophy under the condition of observing the fundamentals of Islam, then it stands to reason that the practice of doing philosophy without that condition or restraint should be even worse even more worthy of condemnation and prohibition. Okay, this argument cannot be defeated by bringing up the historical fact that the Salaf did not bother with warning against philosophy per se as much as they bothered with fighting kalam in general. This is irrelevant because kalam is by all means a practice of scholastic philosophy in and of itself, following the tradition of the Greek Academy as it stands. Okay, and it is only because of the fact that it was founded on the very same methodological and normative issues that we pointed out earlier, okay, that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah bothered at all to write what he wrote in criticizing the method of the logicians. Right, the entire treatise is written because of that. Because at some point, some mutakallimin like Abi Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah claimed that a scholar who doesn't know Greek logic cannot trust the validity of any argument he makes in religious sciences in general. Because to this day, mutakallimun are bent on teaching Aristotelian logic in the religious academies in mutun that they wrote, despite the fact that the logicians themselves are no longer teaching it, the Aristotelian logic, except perhaps as part of the history of philosophy and logic. So it amazes me to no end that a book written to warn Muslims against teaching logic, arguing that logic is neither needed for the smart nor is it helpful for the stupid, that very same book is now taken by some to encourage Muslims to study and practice philosophy, just because he said at one point in the book, some instance, that sometimes it might be useful with those whose predisposition to philosophy has overwhelmed their minds to present the truth to them written in the form of long, sophisticated arguments with premises composed of the philosophical and kalam terminology they like to read. So if by philosophers we mean those who abide with what could be called the Greek principle of argumentative sophistry, okay, I like to term it that as such, the doctrine or the principle of argumentative sophistry, the very principle the book was written to warn Muslims against, by the way, the one that spawned the kalam cosmological argument and the kalam method in general, then obviously whatever he means in this instance has nothing to do with encouraging Muslims to become philosophers themselves, engaging in the scholastic framework established by the Greeks and followed by Ahlul Kalam, making up arguments using the prevailing metaphysical theory to prove that the world had in fact a beginning, is a practice that he condemned in no uncertain terms, rahimahullah, and you can find it plenty in his books. It is fairly obvious that whatever philosophy is, it's not the mere process of thinking or reasoning properly or coming up with evidence or proof or argument in favor of a particular claim. If that were the case, then the scholars in all fields and disciplines of human knowledge would classify as philosophers. Actually, all humans would then classify as philosophers. Okay, and that's obviously not true. That's not what we mean when we call somebody a philosopher. Furthermore, if by philosophy you mean the process of sophisticated scholarly reasoning, okay, systematic reasoning, then all scholars and researchers who do that every day in all fields and disciplines of human knowledge, including fiqh and usul al-fiqh, the science of hadith and the like, al-ulum al-shar'iyya kullaha, would then qualify as philosophers. But then again, clearly that's also not what anybody means when they identify someone as a philosopher. So you guys should at least agree with me that the practice of philosophy is not just any process of reasoning or sophisticated reasoning. It's a particular process that follows a particular tradition in posing questions and in addressing them and debating on them. There are disciplinary conditions without which your reasoning would not classify as philosophy, no matter how sophisticated or well-argued your reasoning is. Okay, it might be considered scholarly reasoning in some field or in some aspect, but not philosophy necessarily. You have to be willing to doubt all beliefs and eventually let go of them, no matter how firm you claim they are for you, how clear you claim they are for you, and to permit all kinds of debate, no matter how heretic you think the opponent's position really is, and to build your entire belief system on metaphysical analogies and deductions from first principles, whatever those may be. You do that, and you would be regarded as a philosopher, or at least your reasoning would qualify as philosophical reasoning, in some sense. That's the Greek scholastic tradition that Ibn Taymiyyah waged his war against in his books. And while he only identified it as Greek philosophy or Aristotelian in some instances, seeing as he never really saw another discipline of metaphysical philosophy to address with anything, good or bad, taking dominion in his time, yani. And considering that philosophers were the ones engaged with mathematics, astronomy, and the natural sciences back then, such useful sciences that were pioneered and spearheaded by none other than the Greek philosophers and their students, and only taught in schools of philosophy, which is what really matters here, he couldn't condemn the practice of philosophy per se, like our academic philosophy. Yet he waged his intellectual war against the very principles that separate what we would identify today as a professional philosopher from what we would now call a scholar of any other practice or any other science. Okay, today nobody calls a mathematician or a chemist a philosopher, for example, regardless of how they define philosophy. Okay, although a mathematician might in fact engage with those practices characteristic of an academic philosopher, of course. A mathematician might in fact philosophize or do philosophy in many instances, as we elaborated in another context. Okay, but that still doesn't make him a professional philosopher. All right, it makes him a mathematician, according to today's terminology at least. All right, much of what people would call physics is in fact bad philosophy. Okay, and as it's well known, physics itself used to be called until recently the natural philosophy. Okay, and much of what physicists are doing is in fact bad philosophy, or by Ibn Taymiyyah's terminology, philosophy under the Greek tradition. Now, looking at the very subject matter addressed by cosmology, for example, tells you immediately that this is nothing but scholastic metaphysics with a modern flavor. In fact, I can recall some prominent philosophers of science. I can recall some prominent authors and publicizers of science who called cosmology just that, bad philosophy. Okay, it's not. I'm not making that up. It's not my own. It's not just my own thinking or my own position against it. Now, looking at the very subject matter addressed by cosmology, for example, tells you immediately that this is nothing but scholastic metaphysics with a modern flavor. All right. What do you mean exploring the origins of the universe? What do you mean by doing that? The very concept of it. What does that mean to you? When has anybody ever seen other universes come into being and thereby use the observations of this particular universe we live in as evidence to tell us how exactly it was created? Okay. When did anybody observe that? When did it ever happen to anybody to have experience with how universes are created in general, and thereby practice abductive reasoning in explaining why our universe is the way that it is? Deep, sophisticated, and consistent mathematics does not guarantee an ontology that is true, does not give you something that would justify the very act of practicing mathematical reasoning in this subject matter to begin with. Now, the point is, we choose to define a philosopher as someone who suffers from all the methodological and epistemological issues that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah fought against and identified as a Greek doctrine of philosophy. Because as we can see, and as we've pointed out earlier, they still exist today, those problems. Okay? Doing philosophy, accordingly, is the act of theorizing where no theory should be proposed to answer a question that either should not be posed for methods of human reasoning to answer it, deduction, analogy, induction, or abduction, or should not be asked at all in the first place. Okay? All theories that take the universe at large as their subject matter, for example, are an application of human reasoning where it does not apply. Okay? This principle of universal theorization, starting with claims that describe a certain element of existence in the sense that wherever or whenever it exists, it must be such and such. This principle of metaphysical reasoning was founded by Greeks, and yet it still drives theorists in pretty much all Western academies and all modern sciences, but both natural and human. This, of course, is not to say that we should reject the greatest majority of theories in all of those sciences and all those fields. No, I'm not saying that. It simply means that the need has become dire, quite dire, to learn how to tell a good theory from a metaphysical claim that should not have been made in the first place. To tell good science from philosophy, from naturalism, okay, naturalistic doctrine, naturalistic mythology. This principle of metaphysical theorization, the Greek principle I call it, and the sophistry that it comes from, is precisely what Kalam is founded upon. Al-Kalam was founded on a response that conceded to the philosophers' epistemic condition of founding the belief of the existence of a creator to this world upon the then prevailing metaphysical theory that determines types of things that can or cannot exist in this world. At the time, this just happened to be the substance attribute theory, or نظرية الجوهر والعرض, alright? They knew that in order for the philosophers who pioneered the sciences of the time, the academies of the time, to give them any recognition at all, okay, they had to submit to the belief that everything that existed in the world was made up of substances, and that the very notion of events taking place, any event, by the very meaning of the term event, hadith itself, can be nothing other than attributes, okay, shifting and shuffling over substances. أعراض تتقلب على الجواهر. Whatever those are, okay, those substances. Change, motion, time, all those concepts were redefined according to that theory in a way that makes them apply to nothing in existence besides the substances of this world. If X exists and it moves, then it can only be made of substances, okay, the attributes of which amount to what we would call motion. If X exists and it changes, then this can only be explained by the attributes of substances, and so on. Okay, they say that's what it means to come up with metaphysical definitions, to redefine certain concepts metaphysically. And so it follows that if you wish to argue for an entity that is not of this world and is not made of substances, okay, you have to strip it from all attributes that would imply such meanings as change, time, motion, speech, etc. And that's what Mutakallimun did, and that's why they did it. All right, entire doctrines of belief, firaq, okay, sects of belief, are now built upon this theory and the metaphysical definitions and implications that it comes with, just because it happened to prevail at the time that the early Mutakallimun built their arguments. Okay. Had things been different, and they had relativistic cosmology at the time, for example, then today we would have a completely different landscape of sects of Mutakallimin. You would have sheikhs that teach space-time metaphysics in their creeds instead of Aristotelian logic and Greek metaphysics. Right? Things would look quite different today. Had they not suffered from submission to the Greek scholastic ethos of metaphysical theorization, no such thing as ilm kalam, the practice that was condemned by the Salaf, would have ever emerged at all. And the practice of rational argumentation in favor of the existence of Allah would have never included arguments that build upon some metaphysical theory about the world and what it's made of, the theory and its definitions. Okay, it would never have taken a stance of someone who submits to the philosopher's claim that the existence of a maker for the world can only be known through his theory on how the world works or what it's made of. Okay, you have to start by submitting to the theory that he believes in. Rather, the argumentation for the truth would have been an affirmation of fitrah and what it entails, showing the appalling entailments of beliefs that go against fitrah, rather than seeking to construct that fitrah itself on some metaphysical thesis or theory in cosmology. The way would then be that of someone who seeks to destroy all those beliefs and theories that gave this or that philosopher the tools to cultivate a deeply elaborate lie to themselves and to their followers, rather than render those lies themselves an epistemologically plausible position, okay, an arguable position, and the underlying metaphysical theories, facts that provide premises for the belief in Allah. However, the practice of kalam and its philosophical debate in attempt to establish the existence of Allah resulted in the belief in Allah becoming such a difficult conclusion to reach, as noted by Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim and other scholars of Ahl Sunnah rahimahumullah. Not only is it rendered a sophisticated theoretical enterprise, it actually becomes such a complex and uncertain, perplexing item of debate that it leaves one with the impression that there is no single prevailing argument that establishes the existence of Allah without an infinite barrage of objections from the opponent, each of which would open an endless debate, which it does, by the way. That's what you will find if you look at the literature of philosophers and Mutakallimin. Sophisticating and compounding such issues in the way that metaphysicians do is absolute sophistry, and yet engaging it in such a way only gives it epistemic and intellectual legitimacy. Okay, it creates a culture where this is legitimate, where this is the only way for people to be justified in their faith and in their belief. Okay, that's the problem here. That is obviously not the way of the Sahaba and the Salaf, obviously. and it is the basic reason why they condemned the practice of kalam, the Greek metaphysical tradition, okay, the philosophical framework of it. The implication was the emergence of extreme irja, al-irja al-ghali, okay, which was another reason why the Salaf condemned al-kalam, okay, the practice of kalam. Obviously, when you turn the normal process of reasoning that establishes faith in a man's heart unto its head, turning belief in the existence of Allah into a potentially uncertain end or result to be achieved after a bleak, convoluted journey, okay, then your definition of iman, ta'rif al-iman عندك, would describe the position that one attains as the crowning achievement after years of relentless debate in doubt and despair, if at all, if you ever reach anything at all. Okay, a believer would then be that who finally emerged from that roller coaster standing on his feet. Okay, the mu'min would be one who simply believes that Allah exists. Okay, and thereby you would define belief, iman, as believing that God exists, at-tasdiq, which is what happened in reality. Okay, since the kalam journey ends where a proper Muslim should begin, the definition of iman would inevitably reflect this miserable fact, this inverted condition of reason. Another entailment of the kalam method and the sophistry it was founded upon, okay, is the condemnation of any faith that presupposes the existence of Allah as though it were a fact that does not require argumentation one way or another, that does not require deduction to establish it one way or another. Okay, deductive reasoning in the metaphysical sense that was established by the Greeks. Okay, if a muqallid, okay, one that follows blindly, is anyone who believes in something without having sufficient reasons to embrace that belief, and if it is established that the belief in Allah is a theoretical stance that takes quite a lot of effort to establish beyond any reasonable doubt, then those who skipped all that effort and just chose to believe must be charged with blind following or taqlid. And that's where the problem of taqlid fil iman emerged from. That's why they had that issue, mutakallimun. How do they know that they were indeed created at all? A Muslim, how does a Muslim know that they were indeed created at all if they don't even know that the world had a beginning in the past? And how would they know that if they didn't perform a metaphysical deduction, a process of metaphysical deduction to come up with that fact? Okay, Mutakallimun thus had to succumb to those philosophers who have lied to themselves and to others, claiming that such knowledge can only be attained after a deep and sophisticated process of reasoning, a Greek process of reasoning, alright, if at all, and decided to make the act of examining the issue of existence of Allah the first obligation of a mutakallif, أول واجبات المكلفين, okay, and nadar, that's what we call nadar. All these aspects of kalam, as criticized by Ibn Taymiyyah, emerged from the affinity that the kalam method had to the Greek tradition of sophistry and metaphysical deduction, metaphysical theory. The entire thesis of Ibn Taymiyyah was meant to establish this very fact. Alright, that's what Ibn Taymiyyah is about, guys. Okay, so to render the man's position as one who simply encouraged Muslims to study and practice philosophy and to engage in metaphysical debates with philosophers, deductive argumentation, metaphysical deductive argumentation with philosophers the way that mutakallimin did, okay, then the way that the mutakallimin committed themselves to, based on one or two quotations cleaved from one of his books, rahimahullah, this is by all means a crime against the Imam's legacy. Ibn Taymiyyah is one of many Imams of Ahlul Sunnah, not the founder of an innovated creed, alright? Not the founder of a school of philosophy or a school of kalam. So the right scholarly approach to his books would be to understand them within the bounds of what the Salaf believed and the manhaj they committed themselves to. Okay, pay attention here. To read in reference to those Imams that he himself revered, quoted and ascribed himself to in most of his books, like Imam Ahmad, Imam al-Barbahari, Imam al-Khallal, and others. Okay, the Imam was a student of this tradition, not of the Kalam and the Mutakallimin. This needs to be kept clear at all times, guys. It's fairly obvious that the Salaf were committed to condemning the method of Kalam and its metaphysical argumentation in general. They did not mount their attacks against a particular creed of Mutakallimin or a particular sect. No, the practice of Kalam itself was condemned by the Salaf. So we expect to find the method, okay? So we expect to find that condemnation in Ibn Taymiyyah's books and responses to Mutakallimin. And guess what? That's precisely what we find in plenty. In fact, no single Imam in the history of Islam has done half as much as this man did in elaborating the methodological faults in Ilm al-Kalam. So if you guys come across a statement in one of his books that seems to imply otherwise, then you should contemplate the context in which he wrote that statement over and over again, and if all attempts to place it within the Salafi framework fail, then it is only proper to fault the Imam in that statement, while preserving, of course, his stature as a major Imam of Ahl Sunnah, rahimahullah. We are not followers of Ibn Taymiyyah after all, guys. As much as we love and respect the man, we are followers of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his disciples. Nobody after the Prophet is infallible, not even Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyyah rahimahullah. So by no means is it enough or intellectually honest to go quotation fishing in the man's books, extracting some quotes to establish a position that we know for a fact contradicts the teachings of all scholars of Ahl Sunnah we've ever known, while arguing that this is indeed what Ahl Sunnah should do or believe. Okay? So to sum up this discussion on the definition of philosophy, we argue that we should not be bothered by the fact that philosophers themselves have failed to agree on one definition of what it is that they do. It is precisely because philosophy is what we claim it to be that they have failed. Okay? Any position, no matter how irrational or nonsensical, is arguable to a philosopher, as long as it is presented in the context of academic philosophy in a format that philosophers would find appealing. Or challenging or whatever. So we should stick to the general received view amongst scholars of Islam, identifying philosophy with a particular Greek practice of sophistry, one that was originally the subject matter of the term itself when it was invented in ancient Greece, and continues to be the only binding principle to all philosophers to this day. Academy. To be at the core of the philosophical academy to this day, and thereby ruling it out as a fertile soil for religious innovation and heresy. In that sense, both Ibn Sina and Al-Ghazali were indeed philosophers, although the former committed heresies that were denounced by the latter. Okay. They both committed themselves, generally speaking, to the Greek metaphysics, to the concept of Greek, to the practice of Greek metaphysics, both in method and in theoretical content mostly, the theory of substance, attribute, and much of what follows from it, that is, and to the way metaphysical arguments are built to invent beliefs about the world and whatever exists beyond it. Okay, and that's precisely what we would call sophistry, and it is what is wrong with both philosophy and kalam. When asked about philosophy and whether or not it is permissible in Islam to study it in depth, Shaykh al-Imam Muhammad Salih al-Uthaymeen rahimahullah answered saying, philosophy is a distinct Greek discipline of research, where people go so deep in taking judgment from human reason, they end up giving dominion to that reason, to their theories, that is, and rejecting the teachings of Kitab and Sunnah, ما جاء في الكتاب والسنة. As such, philosophy is munkar. Okay, haram. It is not permissible to venture into it. If, however, by philosophy one means wisdom, then this is to be found in Sharia. The Sharia of Islam is all founded on wisdom. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, translation, do they require a judgment from those who are in pagan ignorance? Who judges better than Allah to a people who have certainty? However, we should not say that the wisdom of Sharia is philosophy, because this word is Greek. Rather, we should say that the wisdom of Sharia is wisdom, hikmah. Alright. Now, I cited this fatwa in particular to show that our contemporary scholars of Salafiyya have indeed established a much more mature understanding of Ibn Taymiyyah than those undereducated folks who insist on turning the man into a philosopher and a mutakallim. Okay, so they would feel comfortable and justified in ascribing themselves to both Salafiyya and to the practice of philosophy and kalam. Okay, at this point, I expect that some would say, but if we grant that the term philosophy itself should be used to express the condemnable tradition of the Greeks identified by the general methodological principles you pointed out earlier, the very same principles that made kalam a condemnable practice in the eyes of the Salaf, if we concede to that, it is obvious that this is not how the term philosophy is actually used most of the time in contemporary literature. And when we are trying to judge a certain practice, we don't force our own definition onto the term that those involved with the practice itself would use to describe it, to describe what they do.
Rather, we should look at what practices and activities are currently identified as philosophy and judge each of them on its own merit. And to that I say, of course I agree. I totally agree. You're right. I'm not saying that when we seek to judge a certain practice of or debate or discipline of contemporary knowledge that people would call philosophy, then we would decide that by virtue of the name alone, it should be deemed haram and impermissible just because somebody calls it philosophy. What I have done thus far is provide the working definition that contemporary scholars at least would give to the term philosophy before judging it. Okay, so you should work on identifying what it is that they call philosophy and why they call it that. Okay, it is also the original subject matter of the term itself, the general class of reasoning practices and debates that they would originally identify with the term. Okay, that the philosophers. And so I argue that those who would choose the term philosophy to call any activity or practice that does not fall under that class as previously defined, they are misusing the term. And the same goes for those who would dismiss it when it is due, when something is in fact to be classified as philosophy and you don't call it that, you would also be committing a problem. And that's why I bothered doing what I just did. And if indeed it can be established that Ibn Taymiyyah had a different use of the word philosophy, which includes certain practices that are not haram in Islam or bad for the mind and the heart, and then accordingly he promoted an Islamic practice of philosophy as an Islamic practice of philosophy, then we would say we have a semantic disagreement with him, and that he is not to be followed on that terminology. Okay. Although, as I pointed out earlier, no such claim can be justified by a couple of quotations pulled way out of context from his books. I would go in detail in elaborating that point by commenting on these particular quotations that these guys use, if it wasn't for the constraints of time and space here. Okay, the point though is that philosophy is an ill-reputed word at best, so we should not encourage Muslims to engage with it at any rate. As for certain literature that goes under the name the philosophy of X, where X is science, math, economics, and the likes, then obviously the subject matter of those philosophers, of those philosophies, of those practices that are currently termed philosophies, is one that we Muslims need to study. Okay, to some extent, since nobody should do science without being careful about the proper methods, the presuppositions and presumptions that undergo what he's doing, and the foundations of those beliefs that led much of modern science to be the way that it is. Of course, we need to have a lot of scholarly effort paid in studying those topics in a critical manner, and one that I have to admit is still quite lacking. Okay, but that does not justify the claim that we need to open schools of philosophy as such. Okay, philosophy in general for Muslims to join, not to mention the claim that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah would be on board with that, would promote that. Now some might say, if we did not provide a systematic process of teaching philosophy to Muslims, at least contemporary schools of thought, then how are we expected to forge the proper response to those philosophies in a way that gives people the necessary immunity against them? Okay, sufficient answers and sufficient responses that do give the immunity that we seek. Where would the response come from if Muslims had no academies that teach philosophy and give them the mental skills required to be able to come up with a fitting response? Okay, that some would argue that. And our answer to this is in fact in 3 points. Okay, is threefold. First of all, who said that Muslims should respond to any and all false theories or doctrines or ideas that philosophers invent? Even a philosopher doesn't have to suffer such a charge or commitment. The proper attitude to those falsities that would emerge in philosophy is that of wise neglect and disregard to begin with. Don't dip your head in the trash can and then decide you need to smell more trash so that you could just devise a way to keep out the bad smell. Okay, to identify the bad smell from the good smell. Okay, steer clear from places where those fallacies are propagated, and you should be fine in the first place. If then, and only if, you get exposed by accident to such fallacies, then you should consult a Muslim scholar on what to do about it. Okay, and they would study it, and then they would have to study it as it should be studied, understand what exactly it's all about, and then develop the judgment and the ruling that needs to be developed. And if indeed a particular falsity happens to spread amongst Muslims, then and only then should scholars bother with publishing responses to it, okay, elaborate responses, depending on who exactly is subject to it and what material they are exposed to, which is what incentive, which was the incentive that led Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, to publish everything that he wrote about philosophy and kalam, guys. Ibn Taymiyyah was not a philosopher who was trying to establish a project of philosophy of his own and place himself within this mold, place himself within that academy, or have a part in it, or engage in those debates just because they're there, just because those philosophers published what they did. No, he did that because he found that he was compelled as a Muslim scholar to protect Muslims who have in fact swallowed that stuff that Mutakallimun have come up with. And there were systematic schools that were teaching Kalam and the philosophies that underlie it, the Greek logic of Aristotelians included, of course. They're teaching that stuff systematically, and so somebody had to warn Muslims against the fundamental fallacies, the fundamental problems that all this is founded upon. Okay, and that was what called Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah to write what he wrote, okay, to publish what he published. Okay, it wasn't just because philosophers are saying stuff and he is a philosopher and so he must be interested in responding to that stuff and promoting his own view or establishing his own school of his own theory of knowledge and all that stuff that those guys are claiming him to have been doing. Okay, no, none of that. He was a Muslim scholar who felt the religious responsibility to come up with material to protect Muslims against all those fallacies, against all those problems that those philosophers were committed to, against all the fallacies that the Kalam itself was founded upon. All right, to protect this, and that's what you will find in his books. You will find the Quran and the Sunnah being elaborated the way they should be understood, and defended. That understanding would be defended rationally in each and every way that a Muslim scholar should bother with. Okay. So that's why he wrote what he wrote. Okay, that's why Muslim scholars bother with publishing what they publish in response to philosophers and to mutakallimin. In addition, the sources for the outbreak should of course be quarantined. Another point, additional point that should be added here, that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah would advise the rulers of his time, okay, to not allow such books to be published, to not allow such fallacies, such bid'ah to be such innovations to be spread among Muslims. Okay, unlike a philosopher, if he were indeed a philosopher, he wouldn't mind at all that people read the writings of his opponents along with his own. Okay, that people would compare, that people would make their own decisions, their own minds, and all that stuff that we thought that philosophers would promote. Okay, he wouldn't. It wouldn't make a difference to him.
In fact, he would be happy to let them spread what they have, so that he would show himself to be a great philosopher, a great thinker who can, in fact, refute what they produce and what they say. It would make him happier. But that's not what he did. That's not what we see him do. Okay, whenever he had the chance to advise against publishing this stuff in the first place, that's what he was compelled to do as a Salafi scholar, not a philosopher. All right.
By no means is the proper conduct with respect to philosophy and the false doctrines of philosophers is to establish an academy that teaches their theories to Muslims on the grounds that this is the only way for them to learn how to respond. Come on, guys. Okay, that's obviously false. The second point here is that scholars of Islam usually need not get too deep or go too deep in the false doctrines and creeds they are refuting for their reputations to convince the majority of believers and Muslim believers. And this is something that needs to be made quite clear here, because some would find the responses of most major scholars, at least contemporary scholars, to certain theories or doctrines of modern philosophy quite brief, and thereby would immediately judge them as lacking. That, I contend, is usually the sentiment of one who has gotten used to reading philosophy and following the way that philosophers debate and argue with their peers. As I pointed out earlier, you're not a philosopher at any capacity unless you're willing to dive into a bottomless pit of sophistry with those who disagree with you, in argument and counter-argument, following the rules of the trade in the process. No philosopher would submit when you tell him that what you disagree with him about is a rational necessity or a religious necessity, and no debate should be allowed on it to begin with. So the default approach is to provide the briefest and most minimal answer to be published among affected Muslims, so as not to accidentally expose most of them to false arguments and claims they have never been subjected to before, or rouse unwelcome questions or debates amongst them. Okay, you attend to the problem with no more refutation or discussion than needed, than what you absolutely have to provide. Okay, we're not doing philosophy when we write our responses. Rather, we're fixing the damage that philosophers have actually caused to the Muslim community. So let's always keep that in mind. Keep your response to the minimum. Okay. Third, as for the mental skills and abilities, of course we get more of them the more we expose ourselves to debates and arguments about theoretical issues. But that's it, guys. That's just it. Theoretical issues is the key word here. Train your mind by listening to debates among scholars on issues that do in fact require careful consideration of the evidence and the opposing evidence. For this is what hones the skills and sharpens the mind. If, however, the debate takes a rational or religious necessity for a topic, this would have the adverse effects of that's what we call sophistry, of course. This would have the adverse effects we pointed out earlier, least of which is to pull an otherwise safe and sheltered Muslim to the grounds of doubt and uncertainty, to drag them to the grounds of doubt and uncertainty, having them wonder how to refute a certain objection, feeling that unless the objection is answered, then there would be little merit for the faith itself. Okay, one that, if left unchecked, would threaten to drive one to disbelief, to leave the deen entirely. So in what sense and by what reason could we believe that teaching Muslims philosophy, as hereby defined, is good for the mind? Well, far from it. Okay, so to sum it all up, my advice to these brothers is to stick to what our major ulama scholars are teaching, ulama Ahl Sunnah, ulama Salafiyya, and quit trying to achieve a false middle ground. Our scholars know Ibn Taymiyyah better than any of you guys, even those of whom have not read Al-Radd al-Manatiqa or Dar al-Ta'arud, okay? Not because they are good philosophers or because they know Ilm al-Kalam like you guys are so intent on propagating and promoting, but because they have the Sunnah and the tradition of the Salaf running through their veins, okay? It appalls me really to see preachers who claim to be Salafis and yet they insist on pushing their followers to study Ilm al-Kalam systematically, along with logic and philosophy, if they wish to understand Ibn Taymiyyah properly. Seriously, guys, what do you expect would happen to a student of religious sciences when he starts his studies, Talab al-Ilm, and his studies of Islam, with philosophy and Kalam? Most likely he would end up becoming an Ash'ari or Mu'tazili or something in between, which is what most of these fellows really are at the end of the day, by the way, unbeknownst to many of them, unfortunately. Okay, many of you guys are actually Ash'ari, not Salafi. Okay, you just don't know that because you didn't study the Islamic creed properly, the Salafi creed like you should. I would go on a limb and say, don't study these two books by Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah if you find them hard to comprehend. Don't study them. There's nothing wrong with that. They were not written for you anyway. Okay, it's okay, and it's no shame to skip entire sections of these books as you read through them, if indeed you have achieved the level of religious knowledge, not philosophical knowledge, that qualifies you to read them at all. It's okay if you don't read those books. It's okay if you become a scholar of Islam and you don't read these books. It's okay. Okay, what's not okay though is taking routes of learning that were not observed by the Salaf or by Ibn Taymiyyah himself, who became an Imam of the Hanbali Madhab at a very young age before he started reading philosophy at all, okay, and then claim that this is the right way of the Salaf. What's not okay is when you found your faith and knowledge of Aqeedah on the principles of the very same sects of Mubtadi'ah that you claim you wish to understand Ibn Taymiyyah's responses so you could follow him properly. So in short, one is either a Salafi or a philosopher / mutakallim, guys. You cannot be both. You cannot be both at the same time. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. May Allah guide you all to the right path. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.